Great. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this modus of measurement session, where we'll be exploring participatory decision-making and deliberation. I'm Michael, Research and Policy Associate at the Government Outcomes Lab, and together with Nigel and Dawn from Collaborate, we convene the modus of measurement group. And just a quick piece of housekeeping before we start. The session's being recorded and will be made available on YouTube afterwards. And we have two really great speakers lined up today who I think will hopefully bring two different but hopefully complementary perspectives on how we might include people who are affected by a decision in making it and why we might do that. But I sort of wanted to begin the session by kind of acknowledging a bit of a tension here with the name of the group, modus of measurement. Is this really kind of about measurement? I think maybe in the narrow sense it isn't, but I think as a group, we've always taken quite a liberal sense of what measurement actually entails. And to the extent we want to think about a bit differently about how we inform decision-making, who we listen to, how we include those people who maybe often don't have a voice in decision-making, I think this is kind of squarely within what the group's interested in. I don't think any of us are really interested in measurement for its own sake. Particularly, we want to think about how we inform better approaches to accountability, to shaping better practice of services, and so on. So hopefully that gives a bit of context to why we're doing this session that isn't really measurement, but sort of feeds into that broader theme. So with that in mind, I think we can get straight into our first speaker. Dr. Ẹniọlá Ṣóyẹmí is Departmental Lecturer in Political Philosophy and Public Policy here at the Blavatnik School of Government, the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on African and contemporary political, moral, and legal philosophy, where she works on questions of freedom, injustice, democracy, deliberative and participatory practice, authority, and equalities of power. So Ẹniọlá, do you want to take it away?
Thanks so much, Michael, and thank you for inviting me to this. This is a really great way to be useful. Philosophy is not often famed for being useful in everyday practical life by other people who aren't philosophers. Generally, philosophers think we're being very useful, but anyway, this is great. So my comments are going to come in three general parts. The first is to just sort of flesh out what I see as the main arguments that are embedded in a lot of the mainstream normative literature on deliberation and participatory democracy. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I think is wrong with the current literature, or at least incomplete. And actually both wrong and incomplete from my perspective, and then offer a different account that comes from investigating how thinkers outside of the mainstream, in particular people like Kwasi Wiredu, who's a Ghanaian philosopher and who has worked on questions of deliberation. He's dead now, but he worked on questions of deliberation for a very long time. And then tie some of this into the practice of deliberation, which is, and how that practice is evolving in political engagement as it's becoming more and more used in political decision-making. And we get more and more organizations like Engage and others who are really focused on making this something that is useful and not just, in our textbooks and stuff. So first, the current mainstream normative philosophy literature on deliberation is generally based in a notion of deliberation as justificatory. Now, I'll explain what I mean by justificatory and justification in a second. But basically, deliberation is seen as something that is opposed to current models of doing democracy. So aggregative models of doing democracy, where people go out and vote, right? We know the model, we all participate in this. You go out, you vote. The politicians and political parties shout at you for a few months before the election. And then this prompts you to go and make a decision at the ballot box, and that aggregates all our preferences, and all our preferences are assumed to be condensed into this one choice making. And it aggregates all our preferences, and whichever preferences are in abundance or the loudest wins. And of course, there's, you know, modifications. There's societies that have not necessarily first past the post voting, but more methods of counting, shall we say, that are more equalizing. But nevertheless, it is still an aggregation procedure, even when power is shared, like in, you know, numerous European countries. And what deliberation is seeing as doing is saying, well, okay, political life doesn't have to be this brutish and this competitive, you know, and this insane. And actually, it's not, this isn't a reflection of people's genuine preferences, because it's not taking into account how the political system shapes our preferences. It assumes that our preferences are exogenous to political decision-making, and we come in, you know, fully understanding what our preferences are, and then we tick the box. And that's just not how politics works. It's not how ordinary people work. It's not how politicians work. And also, it's not actually as legitimate to the very purpose of democracy that we are trying to achieve, right? Because the whole point about democracy is that it's a legitimation exercise. It's something that allows us to say, hey, here's a decision that's being made, or here's a party in office. And the reason why they're in office is because we want them to be there, right? So democracy is not a dictatorship, and it's not other forms of government for this one precise reason. It gives us a legitimating function that other procedures don't give us. But the ways in which we are practicing democracy makes that either hypocritical or redundant, or in some way, it's not actually fulfilling that legitimating function of democracy. So here's a different way of doing it that would allow us to have that legitimating function in a more genuine way. And so we have deliberation. And so a lot of the normative mainstream literature says what deliberation is doing is allowing for that self-legislating capacity that true democracy is really meant to be about. And in terms of like the ground texts that people are coming from, I mean, a lot of it is Rousseau, but some of it is Mill. It's in quite a, you know, it's not as narrow as people think. It's a relatively diverse philosophical literature that influences this kind of thinking. But basically it says deliberation also allows us to build a common good. It allows us to build understandings about consensus, about ourselves as a community. And it also allows us to see how preferences get changed. So this is a big thing in the normative literature, that deliberation is somehow transformatory, where standard or aggregative models of democracy assume our preferences to be exogenous to the political system. Deliberative accounts take our preferences to be endogenous to the political system. They're shaped by the interactions that we're making in deliberation, and people get to understand that. And so we have discussion, and it's this talk-centric understanding of coming to a decision. And so that justifies the decision. So then this is what we mean by justification. I mean, justification has a bunch of different meanings. And if you're doing legal philosophy like I am as well, then it's even more confusing, because justification means something completely different there than it does to a lot of political philosophers. But in any case, in this justification, at least the type of justification that I'm focused on in my work, it has this understanding about something that you can accept as a legitimate decision because you have been party to making it. So it is justified over your action. And then it moves to an understanding of justification as action. So it justifies your action So you have people like Joshua Cohen, Amy Gutman. I mean, it's basically a lot of the mainstream literature that has this notion of justification as self-legislating and then switching into justification as action. And so this method of deliberating then gives you a decision that you can take as legitimate because the procedure has involved you influencing the decision. So there's a lot of, I should qualify it by saying there's a lot of disagreement between philosophers as to how seriously to take this type of justification and whether this more procedural idea of justification is sufficient to convey a deeper understanding of legitimacy, i.e. that a decision is good in and of itself, right? This is not because I said it, it's not because you said it, it's a good decision. If Jesus were to see it, he'd be like, this is a great decision, right? It's a morally coherent decision. And that's a very hard argument to make about deliberation, right? Because it's just not clear why you or I or any normal human being would come to a morally just decision just because they were the ones to think about it, right? We're really great, but we're not as clever as we think we are. But the procedure, right? Even if you can't make that step, the argument is that the procedure of deliberating gives you some substantive sense of legitimacy, that deliberation is at least better than odds chance of getting to a legitimate decision. So this is something called Cordyceps theorem, and we don't need to get into that. So this is the problem that I see with the current mainstream deliberative literature. I think it's confused, and I think it overestimates what it thinks justification is doing. And it overestimates how it thinks deliberation can get us to justification. I think it has an idea about deliberation where it thinks deliberation can get us to something like an overlapping agreement. And that overlapping agreement is then sufficient to justification. And I think if that was true, if deliberation could get us to overlapping agreement, then the arguments about justification would be logically sound. But I don't think deliberation does get us to overlapping agreement. But I also think it's a good thing that it doesn't get us to overlapping agreement. I think it gets us to something called decisional agreement. You can come to a decision as a result of deliberating, and that decision might involve some transformatory value, because yes, deliberation is talk-centric. It does allow us to see other people's points of view, and it does allow us to assess our own points of view based on what other people have said. But it's not transformatory in the sense that it will suddenly make me a different person. It's not transformatory in the sense that it will suddenly make me you, so that I can then accept your reasons overlapping as mine and then justify my action based on your reasons, which will then be the same as my reasons because of deliberation. So deliberation is not that magic, but it's not, I don't think it should be that magic. I think in a world of reasonable pluralism, and what we mean by reasonable pluralism is people who are different in terms of their moral and normative ideals, it is necessary that deliberation does not get us to overlapping agreement. But then the other thing that looking at the philosophical construction of people like Kwasi Wiredu does for me is that he takes pluralism, I think, a lot more seriously than mainstream deliberative democracy takes pluralism. I think sometimes mainstream deliberative democracy takes pluralism as this kind of group caricature. So where deliberation doesn't work is because you've got Black people and they're all the same, you've got white people and they're all the same, you've got Arabs and they're all the same, and they will all disagree with each other because somehow these group characteristics are incompatible and everybody is mad on the basis of their own group characteristics, and that's when deliberation won't work. And deliberation will work where these groups are somehow similar enough. And so you have these kind of arguments based on nationalistic tendencies that, oh, deliberation works best when you have a common good. And the biggest the biggest pushback against this is from someone like Iris Marion Young, who says this is a very illogical and circular argument. You need a common good that will then get you to a common good. Which is it? Either deliberation gets you to a common good, or there's a pre-existing common good that makes deliberation work. It can't be both. And you get yourself, a lot of deliberative theorists get themselves into a tizzy because they end up saying things that I don't think they actually mean to say, which is that somehow deliberation actually works better when groups are composed of people who are similar to one another in their outward characteristics, which is, for want of a better word, nonsensical. So one of the things that looking at people like Ruedu is that he's conceptualizing pluralism at the individual level. He thinks we're all different within groups as well. No two people are the same. People have different conceptions about, thanks, Michael. People have different cognitive interpretations of themselves and their own lives and the way in which they wish to be free. And that's a good thing, because those freedoms depend on one another. I need the guy who understands himself as a chair maker to make chairs so I can sit on it and philosophize. And the person who thinks philosophy is useful needs me to have come from the background that I've come from to get to the place in life where I think this is how I wish to be free, as crazy as that sounds. So it's not a bad thing that people are different from one another. And one of the things that deliberation does is get us to that decision-making capacity that allows us to actually see all those differences and see the ways in which those differences depend on one another, in order to come to some decision that makes some of those differences actualizable. So does this mean that I think that we need less deliberation just because it doesn't get us to justification? No, I think we need more deliberation. I think we need more deliberation because I think the real normative good of deliberation is to actually get us to see that there is no, there's no original position in which we're the same, basically. So, I mean, those of you who know the literature will know that I don't agree with rules, and I don't agree with rules in procedure. I don't think there is an original, I don't think the veil of ignorance is a good thing. I don't think it's plausible either. But one of the things that deliberation in my conception is that it just removes that, and it says, actually, this difference is a good thing. And it's something that deliberation helps us see and cultivate and understand. And so when, to tie a little bit into the practical ramifications, when, you know, organizations, again, getting deliberative sessions together and they go, okay, we've got, you know, we're going to do a deliberation of 30 people and we've got 15 people from this group. And okay, we're going to sprinkle it with 2 people from this group and 2 people. And okay, we've got, that's it. We've got our DEI boxes covered. And that means that when we come to a decision, we'll be able to tell all the people in these communities that the decision is justified. I think this is a lot of, it may not be at the forefront, but I think it underlines a lot of how deliberative sessions in real life are conducted. And I think that's a little bit misguided. And I think what you need is many more deliberative sessions. Some of them will be people from all the same place. And then you run another one on the exact same question with a different configuration and a different configuration. And it's arduous and it's painstaking. And it means that we're spending 4 out of 5 of our days in deliberative sessions. But, you know, you said you wanted to do democracy. So then let's do democracy. And that's what it means. It means more and more and more deliberation on the same questions, with the understanding that deliberation isn't there just to get you to a justificatory decision, but to actually get deliberants to understand each other properly as human beings who are different and dependent on one another. I think I've made time.
Great. Thanks so much, Ẹniọlá.
Yeah.
I think that was a really both a very accessible introduction to the philosophy of deliberation, but I think really has that kind of practical, those real clear practical implications for how we might rethink perhaps how we do deliberation in practice. So coming on to more thinking on deliberation in practice, our next speaker is Miriam Levin. Over the course of organising this session, she was promoted to Chief Executive of Engage Britain. Engage Britain are an independent charity that brings together people across the country with different views, knowledge and experience to debate and create the plans they want to see. Miriam has 20 years experience of developing and implementing strategies around community action and participation. So I think kind of drawing on her experience and the work of Engage Britain, hopefully she can give us a sense of how we might take some of these ideas from the philosophy to the actual practice. Miriam.
Brilliant, thank you. And I just start by saying, hey, thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here, but also Ẹniọlá, thank you for that. I was like scribbling things down like frantically, like that is such a brilliant way of saying it. So that was super, super helpful for me. So hopefully I can kind of add something into this kind of conversation as well. And I think what I'm going to do is actually a really nice counterpoint to what Ẹniọlá just talked about, that kind of we take that kind of deep thinking about how and why we as a country, or we as a people need deliberation and kind of different forms of democracy. And what we've tried to do at Engage Britain is kind of put it into practice. It's like, okay, how do you take these ideas and try and run them in such a way that it really puts people at the heart of how, for us, political decisions are made? That's kind of what we focus on. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to talk a little bit about Engage Britain, why we're here, what we do, and then really talk through the practicalities. Like, okay, so we've actually run an end-to-end policy-making process, putting people at the heart. And I just wanted to give people a bit of a sense of how we've done that, to really think about, well, what are the methodologies that we use, that we ran together in such a way that really enables people to have voice kind of in the system. So let me see if I can make this work. Michael, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Brilliant, thank you. Cool. So, yeah, this is me. I'm Miriam Levin. As of about a month ago, I'm the Chief Executive of Engage Britain, which is wonderful and terrifying at the same time. But for those of us that, like in the room who don't know too much about Engage Britain, I thought it'd be useful just to kind of give a little bit of background as to kind of who we are and why we are. So essentially, we were set up a few years ago on the basis that there's huge, huge challenges that our country is facing, like big intergenerational problems around housing, around the environment, about health and care, and government is just not cracking them. And we were looking really closely. It's like, okay, so there's many reasons why government is not cracking some of these like massive challenges. A lot of them are about our kind of a very adversarial kind of political system, representative politics, about how voting works, kind of all the sort of things that Ẹniọlá was just talking about there. And there's all sorts of problems within the system that really mitigate against excellent decision-making that really works for people. But we thought we'd hone in on the one issue that we think is kind of at the heart of all that, which is that when politicians make decisions about public policy that affects all of us and affects all of our daily lives, they don't involve the people who are going to be at the kind of sharp end of that. They don't talk to the people who are going to be kind of bearing the brunt of that policy, having to put it into practice. And because of that, decisions are made, don't really work. They have all manner of unintended consequences. Or I like to think they're unintended. It's like, because I really think there's certain policies you wouldn't make if you really knew that's what the impact was going to be. And then the government does something, I'm like, oh, you probably do know that that's going to happen and you're just bad. But then I try and kind of work my way out of that kind of cynical view and think, you know what, there is a better way of doing policy making. That if you put people at the heart of it, if you really put the people who are going to kind of have to bear the brunt of this idea, of this decision, you would come up with better decisions at the end of the day that really work for people. So we sometimes talk about ourselves as a think tank where the people do the thinking, in as much that we actually want to not only show that theoretically this is a different way of doing policy making, but that it could actually work. So we, over the last couple of years, have actually tried to run an end-to-end policy making that puts people at the grassroots really at the heart of coming up with both understanding what the issues are and what the solutions might be. And our ultimate aim is for a future where politicians wouldn't dream of making decisions without involving the people affected by them. It's a long-term vision. I'm not going to say we're going to crack it in the next couple of years, but that's what we're aiming for. So in terms of what we've actually done, we took as our first challenge access to health and care. And the reason we did that is that we ran a series of polls in 2018, 2019, 2020. So kind of essentially before the pandemic and then during the pandemic, and then again in 2021, to ask people what's the number one challenge facing the country. And every single time the answer was access to health and care. So it's like, okay, if that's what people care about, we will take that on. It's massive. We set ourselves this like insanely large exam question, which is how can we make sure that everyone gets the health and care that they need and how we're going to fund it. And I'm going to talk about kind of what we've actually done to try and kind of get across that, answer that question. As a quick overview, we've undertaken this 5-step process, which is firstly about people sharing their views and ideas, like really understanding from people what is the issue. It's not what government says the issue is around health and care and how we need to kind of reorder the institutions and creating integrated care boards or kind of the institutional change that kind of could happen. It's like, well, what do people really care about? What really matters to them about their experience of accessing health and care? And then with that understanding, taking that into a deliberative process to prioritise kind of, well, what is the things that we should be tackling first in all of those many things that are going wrong in health and care. And then from that, understanding, all right, okay, if these are the things that people care most about, what are some of the answers? How do we come up with plans and solutions and ideas that are actually going to fix some of this stuff? We then follow and push at those and test them and improve them to try and make those ideas really practical and implementable. And then the last stage is around advocacy. So how do we actually get those ideas that people have created and generated into the political discourse and into the political implementation? Because that's kind of the point. This is not supposed to be a theoretical exercise. This is supposed to be like, okay, how do we actually really make good policy happen in the real world? So I'm going to kind of drill down into each of those now in a little bit more detail. And I'll rattle through it quite fast because I'm aware it'd be really good for there to be kind of plenty of time for conversation after this. So if there's anything in here you want me to kind of go back to or give more detail, I'm very, very happy to. But quickly, the way we understood and kind of heard from people about what matters to them is that we ran 101 community conversations around the country. They were online discussions led by a host that we identified hosts kind of across the country from all different communities to really just essentially to bring their own friends, neighbours, networks into a conversation. So people who already had trust within a network of people, and they could have a very open and honest conversation about what they feel works really well in health and care now and what could be better. We had about 750 people taking part across England, Scotland and Wales. And what we came out of that was that this incredible richness of first-person stories about, love the NHS, it's wonderful, so lucky to have it. But all of these things are going wrong. But my actual experience was like terrible for this reason, awful over here, and all of these things are going wrong. So we heard a lot of very true and honest and difficult stories about what's happening. We took those stories, those first-person kind of narrations, into our people's panel. So this essentially was a citizens' assembly, kind of deliberative democratic process in a very pure form. 100 people drawn through a sortition process outlined and kind of across the country, representing the entirety of the British public as far as you can in 100 people, but at least in terms of representing kind of the same percentages of various demographic characteristics from age, gender, ethnicity, location in the country, how they voted at the last election, if they voted at the last election, kind of characteristics like that. We brought them together for 12 sessions, 4 weekends, in autumn 2021. And their job was to bring their own perspectives into the room about their own experiences of health and care, to hear the range of stories that we collected through the community conversations, and to really sift through those and prioritize and go, okay, of all of these things going wrong, which of the issues should we tackle first? Because there's a lot going wrong in health and social care right now. And neither we nor anyone else can deal with it all at the same time. But what do the people think should be tackled first? Sorry, desperately trying to move my slide on, and it seems to not want to move on. Hold on 1 second. There we go. Good. These are just some quotes from people who kind of took part in the process. So this is kind of goes to the heart of what we were doing. It's like, why would people want to get involved? Do people want to get involved in shaping the policies that affect them? And kind of resounding yes to that, certainly from the people who took part. Yes, you can say they selected themselves on the basis that they were genuinely interested in this stuff, but to see the power of the process to enable people to feel like they had a stake in the system, that they could do something that would make a difference, was incredibly powerful. So I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about kind of, well, what did they come up with? What were their priorities? In order to kind of be able to show kind of what we did with the rest of the process. Essentially, out of 4 weekends and 50 hours, they established kind of a priority list of 7 things that were kind of most important. And we said, okay, we'll take the top 2 into the next bit of the process. The first priority they come up with is this one here. It's about workforce. It's like, there's just not enough staff to meet current and future demands in health or social care, which is pretty what you'd expect, really. Like, if you ask anybody kind of what's the problem, it's like, there just aren't enough people. And that leads to all the other problems, like kind of waiting lists and ambulances backing up. It's a massive problem. The second issue was all around the poor communication between the NHS and people, which was really surprising. And actually, it was surprising to us because this isn't something that is talked about on a political level. It's not talked about really by the NHS. It's not something that's really in the discourse at all. And yet, because it's an issue that affects basically everybody, that became the issue that people who took part in our process wanted to prioritize. They said, look, it might not be life or death. It's not about curing cancer, but it's just the very simple way that the system communicates with us, which is so bad. It's like so badly done. We feel so lost within and trying to navigate our health system. This is the second thing we want you to deal with. So for us, the deliberative process, surfacing things that are not in the kind of on the political agenda, was fantastic. It's like, okay, we can show that if you talk to people, you get a different set of priorities. We took those 2 issues around workforce and poor communications kind of into our next phase, into a kind of ideas for change process, which was coming up with kind of solutions. I'm not going to talk about the communication one. I'm just going to focus on the workforce priority for now. But like I say, happy to talk about the rest another time. So what we did in order to come up with ideas that are actually going to fix the social care staffing crisis, and we focused on social care staffing rather than healthcare staffing for this bit of the process, is that we went through a co-design, very intensive co-design process. Essentially, we brought together all the people or representatives of the people who are most affected by recruitment, retention, training of staff, of social care staff. So we brought together people who draw on care, frontline workers, care providers, commissioners and directors of adult social services, local authorities, and policy experts. And we said, right, your task over the next few months, 6 months we gave them, and 8 workshops, was to come up with solutions that are actually going to work for all of you. Because there's no point in coming up with a solution that's going to work for like frontline workers, but a care provider can't implement it. Or there's no point in coming up with stuff that's going to make care providers' lives easier, but your director of adult social services cannot commission like that. So really the point of bringing all these different voices together was about coming up with stuff that's actually going to work in practice. They worked, like I say, over 6 months. We had other groups feeding into them, groups of people who draw on care, frontline workers and care providers who fed in their ideas and fed back on the draft ideas that the group came up with. And we had an online platform for people to feed in as well, just so we could open it up to anybody who was interested in putting in ideas to fixing social care staffing crisis. And what we ended up with was a policy package that was made up of both quick wins, like stuff that you could do now that's going to fix things, and the big long-term institutional changes that also need to be made. Much more funding that's actually going to reform social care right at its core. We've then taken those policy package, those ideas, those policies that people came up with, and have tested them. We've gone back out to sector organisations, we've gone back to government staff, we've gone back to the opposition and said, okay, these are it. Where are the bear traps? What have we forgotten? How can we make these stronger? And we've also done polling and public message testing to understand, okay, if we want to push this kind of idea of social care reform further up the agenda, really put it at the heart of what people care about, how do we need to talk about it? What are the messages and the ways of talking about it and framing it that are going to get people interested? Because what we're really, really keen to do is actually move this on so it doesn't become just a theoretical exercise. So for us, it's very much about advocating for change and advocating for change alongside our participants. So it's their voices that are platformed, not mine, not my other kind of the rest of my team at Engage Britain, but it's very much the people who came up with those ideas, were at the heart of understanding kind of what the problem is and what solutions might be. They are the ones who are making the case for change. Because, like I say, what we're trying to do is get this stuff adopted, get this stuff changed. And we're really pleased to say that we're actually starting to we're just in that beginning of that phase now and starting to have some successes, which is fantastic to see. So there was one particular idea that came out of the social care change group's kind of policy package, which was around a green badge for care workers. The parking permit, like the blue badge, really simple idea that if you are a care worker that goes into people's homes, parking is a massive issue, give them a green badge so they can park for free without the hassle, without the stress, without having to spend all the money. And basically I've always spoken to was like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. Really, really straightforward, really simple, relatively simple and straightforward and cheap to implement. So the Labour have said that they would, they're going to be thinking about putting it in their manifesto. We had a Westminster Hall debate with MPs on it last week, and we're now talking to the Minister, the Care Minister, Helen Waitley, about actually what implementation would look like. So like I say, what we're really, really interested in is taking this theory that you can put people at the heart of policymaking and get better decisions, run that process through, and make it a reality. Very quickly, a few lessons that we've learned about how we would do this differently next time, because we're drawing the health and care work to a close and thinking about our future work. We set ourselves too big a challenge. Trying to fix the whole of health and care in a couple of years was basically insane. So going forward, we probably focus on a more defined challenge that really gets to the heart of what matters to people. We'd probably work quicker. We'd try and run a more agile process. We would work in a more simple way around content and consent for using people's words, because that took up a huge amount of time. And rather than, we worked through a lot of partners as we did this, we kind of bolstered our own skill set internally, and we'll work more stuff through ourselves. And finally, we're really interested in taking a toolkit approach. Like, how can we take bits of the process and feed it into the policy-making process at really critical junctures that are actually going to make a difference in the system? And I'm going to close there, but I'd be very, very happy to kind of answer any questions. Like, there's my email address if you want to get in touch, but really looking forward to the discussion and thoughts people have right now.
Great, thanks so much, Miriam. Really interesting to hear how this kind of process might be done in practice, kind of some of the challenges, but also like the real impact you can actually have by kind of taking this approach and really putting it into action. So yeah, now we can open up for discussion. I can see there's been a lot of questions in the chat already. So maybe start with Graham. I can see you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Hi, thanks for that. So I should out myself at the start as a fellow philosopher who thinks philosophy can be useful, though from a very different area of philosophy. So I defer to my honourable colleague on matters political and jurisprudential. But one of the things that strikes me about the interaction between those two talks is, so we've got this justificatory hope for democracy, but there's also one of the arguments for it is that it just gets us good evidence about what's going on, that Whitehall becomes out of touch and the people know what's going on in the real world, you know. But it seems like those two reasons need to be treated kind of separately. So one of the things in that second talk, it is the reason for having people's voices here part of that legitimating thing, that this is representing what the people want? Or is it because we think they know what's going on? And a lot of the questions I saw in the chat about the role of data seem really pertinent there, right? Because we can do data analytics, working out what's going on for people in ways they haven't even spotted yet. We can just get data about their, social media postings and what they're tweeting about. We've got access to more data than we did in Mill or Rousseau's day about what's going on with the individual people. And so the role of people's voices, who may not know what they want, because of course they're being shaped by the propaganda and so on. We need to think about what evidence we're getting from them and what role legitimacy is playing here for including them, because those might actually be in tension in the world of big data.
Thanks, Graham. That's I think a really interesting reflection. I can see a lot of people nodding along with very, very good philosophy. Ẹniọlá, do you want to come back in?
Graham has put it really, really nicely, because some of the thing, Miriam, thank you so much for your talk, because it really helped crystallize some of the more practical issues that I am also having. So I should say, for the paper that I've been talking about, I actually ran a field experiment to see, exactly what Miriam is saying. We talk about people being engaged in decision making. What does it actually look like when they are engaged, and what are the decisions they come up with? I won't go through the experiment because that would take too much time, but the thing that your presentation made me think with the green badge thing that was also relevant for my experiment was it made me think this is a fairly simple policy, right? It's a policy that a set of reasonably thinking politicians could come up with themselves. Did we need people to sit in groups to come up with this particular policy? It was the same with my experiment. We were coming up with the rules for using a bus transportation system in Lagos, Nigeria. And none of the rules were like, oh my goodness, if we didn't have these set of ordinary people together, nobody could have thought of this. So the point about deliberation sometimes, in my mind, I'm trying to figure out, when you say it gets us to better decisions, and this ties into Graham's questions and comments, are they better decisions in some objective sense that nobody would have been able to come up with outside of deliberation? Or are they better decisions precisely because of this legitimating function that we think deliberation is doing when you actually include people in the thing? And so with the green badge thing, my question to you is just like, when that policy is then a policy for a time, and in the way that policies do, sometimes they work really well, but sometimes people get bored of them, or they stop working, or they become, less useful. Will those people, both in the deliberative sessions that you ran and in new deliberative sessions, think that that was the best way to achieve whatever they wanted to achieve for those health professionals? But I don't know. It just gets me to thinking that if we're thinking about deliberation as a specific thing that is doing something genuinely exclusive to itself, right, then it has to be in something that it's letting participants do with regards to each other. And then the reason why it's important to tie that into the political system is to get the political process and politicians and whatever political system that you have fed into whatever it is deliberation is doing for the citizens, rather than just for the decision.
If I come in, I think they're really good questions and really important for us to think about. So you asked, like, would the green badge have been kind of generated? Would you have generated it in the kind of closed political world, closed Westminster bubble? Yeah, probably. Yeah, no denying that it's not an idea that couldn't have come up independently elsewhere. And in fact, some councils do already have something like this. Not all of them, but some of them. So yeah, for sure. But wouldn't it be exciting if we had a political system that just as default, brought in those voices and talked to the people who are on the front line of care, who really do deal with parking issues all the time. Like, actually, could you just sort this out? If you could sort it out like this would be really good. Like, rather than leaving it up to, well, possibly policymakers in Westminster might come up with the right ideas, much better to assume that people are going to be able to come up with really great ideas because they have to live and breathe it every day, and you make that part of the system. And to me, it's not just about coming up with the better policies that are going to improve lives for people, but it's about saying, let's revitalise democracy. Actually, democracy should be so much more than an election once every 4 or 5 years, people go to ballot boxes feeling like that's got absolutely no difference. It's going to make no difference to any decisions taken anywhere. Something that really puts people up at heart. It's about showing that there is another way of doing democracy. And how exciting would it be if that was the way, that was business as usual, that that's how we ran the country. So for me, we're creating these proof points and going, look, let me show you an example of a really great policy that came up as a result of this process. But the idea is so much more than that. It's not just about if we can get green badge implemented, although how fabulous we could, that's going to change lives for people. But how much more exciting is if these are the proof points that we're slowly generating, not just us, loads of organizations out there trying to prove that if you do it like this, people are going to feel so much greater trust in the democratic system, and it will negate some of these like really worrying trends towards autocracy and kind of not just here, but kind of elsewhere in the world, that we can really show that there's a much more exciting, powerful, people-led way of doing politics.
Can I just come back really quickly on that? So I completely agree with you, Miriam. We're not, I don't have, there's no tension, I think, in the fundamentals of what we're saying. But I guess what I'm saying is that some of the ways in which we run deliberative, the practice of deliberative sessions, because they're still so focused on the decision, because we think that the decision is the way in which we get politicians to take deliberation seriously, because politicians want to know, well, what's the outcome of this, right? We're not here to hug each other. We want to know, what can we touch, right? And so we're running deliberative sessions focused just on the decision, but it's not just the decision. And that's part of what you're saying. It's in the process itself. But that means that we should be running deliberative sessions, to my mind, in a slightly different way, in a way that focuses participants' attention on what they're learning about each other as a community. And that means that when we're running deliberative sessions about the same decision, that you're not going to run that green badge deliberative session again with the same people because you think you've arrived at the outcome, right? You think you've got you've arrived at the outcome that you were striving for, which is the green badge policy. Whereas if you were looking at a different outcome, which is those groups of people and other groups of people and other groups of people getting to understand themselves in a much deeper way, then we would be running deliberative sessions literally for the sake of running deliberative sessions and not for the sake of the decision. That's what I'm saying.
Which I think in theory is exciting, but in practice, to me, if you're going to do this, it has to be purposeful. I'm not sure about deliberation just for the sake of it. To me, I think it's more, if it has a purpose, if it's trying to move things on, if it's trying to change the way things are done, whether that's in a specific policy area or generally in how we do democracy, I think that's, just in practical terms, that's more likely to kind of get people wanting to be involved and feeling like it's actually got value in them giving their time to it.
Thanks. It's a very interesting discussion, and I think potentially not something we'll solve today. Although I don't think the two of you are miles apart on it. I think, but yeah, we've got a few more hands gone up. So I think Nigel first.
I feel like I should defer to Felix because I've already asked some questions in the chat. Do you want to go first?
You go ahead, Nigel.
Well, maybe it's more of a reflection than a question, so I can maybe hand on to you guys straight after. But I think that there's different kind of ways to understand this. Obviously, I think this sort of point about are we kind of getting new and original data? I mean, yes, clearly we are, and we have new and more sophisticated ways of understanding this, but it's still putting the power of the decision into the hands of people that we elect. right? So someone else still makes the decision, you know, they're just kind of listening to you. And we've got some of this already, because our political parties run lots of focus groups up and down the country and hear the voices of real people. So, you know, it's not completely revolutionary. So I'm a bit more persuaded by this idea of participation for its own sake, and also this idea of people learning about each other. But I do think there's a real problem in connecting that to our political process, because it is so unfocused, bluntly, you know. I just can't really see. I think it's a good thing. We should do lots of it. I definitely think communities of place, of, you know, all different types of communities should mix and mingle and talk to each other, and we should have more empathy in society. I think it would get us a long way. But turning that into something political, that's the missing link for me. So yeah, I guess that's kind of where I'm up to in my thinking. Maybe let's hear from Felix and Harry. Maybe they've got a real question.
I should have gone first, because Nigel is asking basically all of the questions that I want to ask as well. But so I've been looking at deliberative processes a little bit in practice, and but more in the context of constitution making processes. The interesting thing that I saw there usually was what Nigel just said, was the ones that were unsuccessful were those where there was still a divide between the process and the decision makers. You saw that in Chile, and you saw that in Iceland as well, where the constitutions failed, that were drafted with a lot of deliberative input from citizens. So I wonder whether you had any ideas on how to overcome this divide, which shouldn't be there, because politicians are citizens as well, and where you see the main hurdles of implementing this on a broader scale in institutions and institutionalize such processes. The second question I have is whether you see a potential tension between this kind of deliberation, small scale deliberation, where you have an assembly that is maybe randomly selected, and mass participation, like democratic mass participation. That's something that in Chile was quite interesting, that where they had hundreds of thousands of mini publics, what they called small scale deliberative processes. And then they were confronted with this problem of how do we actually read what people were discussing in these things? And there are some interesting things perhaps with machine learning that are happening there as well, which might be interesting. The last question I have is, in another context where I was working, what you see the possibilities for deliberative processes in fragile and highly divided countries. So in Libya, for instance, you have an extremely divided political system, and every single turn that they took in trying to design an electoral law and choosing ministers from different tribes and different parties always failed. I was always wondering whether you would solve the problem in Libya of finding a good system of government would be by randomly selecting a group of Libyans, and they would then say, this is what we're going to do. And you can't really mess with the questions of legitimacy, because it's randomly chosen. So these are the three things.
Thanks, Felix. I'm not sure we necessarily have time to answer all the questions. Miriam, do you want to?
I'll just touch on the first one, if that's all right, so because I'll keep it brief. But you talked about kind of what are some of the challenges to institutionalization and politicians taking up this sort of kind of different way of doing democracy and doing policy making. I think probably the biggest challenge is a combination of vested interests, lack of bravery, feeling like your job is under threat. Like basically it's very easy to see as a politician, it's like, well, you're coming to me with kind of this way of like, well, people can do it better. People do it better than me, but they elected me. But I am special because I've got this job. And I think we'd all feel that. We'd all feel a bit like, oh God, you're undermining what it is that I think I'm here to do. And I can sort of understand it's a very human response to it. But the way some of the ways around that is to work with people, who can see this is additive. This adds to what you are doing. This is going to help you, because if you can show that you're really listening to people, really taking seriously what they want and need and think and feel, that's going to make you a better person to represent kind of this group of people. If we're going to do this alongside representative politics, and there's different options about not having kind of like really changing the way we do political system, but within the existing system as it stands at the moment, demonstrating kind of the benefits, how it's going to help. And kind of one of the arguments we often use with kind of talk to politicians about, saying like, essentially, give us your hardest problem. Give us like your knottiest, thorniest, most difficult challenge that you know you have to grasp, and you can't, because it's so political, it's so fraught with like party tensions that you can't crack it, and you know it's bubbling away, you know it's something that is just simmering that has to be dealt with. Let us help you. Let us strip out your party politics and your ideology from this. Just take it back to the people and what they want and need. The abortion debate in Ireland is a fantastic example of that. Like the citizen assembly that they ran on that actually got legislators from trying to do 20 incremental changes that nobody interested in to really fundamentally progressive change legislation, was managed through a process of deliberation. And that, to me, it's like, this process managed to unlock a problem that you have not been able to deal with for decades.
Thanks, Miriam. And really a massive thank you to everyone. I think this has been a really great discussion. Obviously, thanks in particular to Ẹniọlá and Miriam for their presentations, and to all of you for taking part. I think we could keep going for many more hours on this. And I think this is a good time to mention, if you do want to kind of keep some of these discussions going, the Social Outcomes Conference, I couldn't not give it a little plug here at the end. We have a call for contributions open at the moment. The deadline's next Tuesday, the 28th of March. And we're covering a bunch of themes: trust and relationships, innovation, kind of dissenting voices, and how you might get voices that are often unheard into kind of decision-making processes. I'm sure a lot of the themes covered today might come up at the conference. I'd encourage you to submit a proposal if you want to, or just sign up for an in-person or online ticket, and hopefully we can pick up maybe some of these themes in September. So yeah, a massive thank you to everyone for taking part. And yeah, I think finished just before time. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, Miriam, Ẹniọlá, Michael. Cheers.